live soon.
I love the status parts, the suspense.
Yeah.
You're okay. Great.
Yeah, perfect. Good morning, everyone. I see Rob is in the chat. Hey, Rob. If everyone can just do me a quick favor and put in your name and your tribal affiliation in the chat box, that would be great. My name is Danielle. I'm a project officer in the Clean Water Tribal section in the Water Division. Real quick, does the panel want to go ahead and just introduce themselves?
Sure. My name is Roberto Gutierrez. I'm a project officer in the Air and Radiation Division here in Region 9.
Great. And I'm Ivan Lieben. I'm in the Office of Regional Counsel here at Region 9, and then I'm one of the attorneys working on the TAS.
And I'm Tom Hagler, and I'm another attorney in the Regional Counsel's Office working on TAS.
Perfect. So this is the TAS session, and we'll be talking about the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act. Let's go ahead and get started. So, Loretta, next slide, please. So the roadmap for today, we're going to have an overview of what is treatment in a similar manner as the state. What is TAS? What programs are eligible? What are the requirements for a TAS application? Why do I want it? And then we'll take a closer look at the regulatory TAS arena. Next slide, please. I think this is Roberto.
Not yet.
Sorry about that. So what is TAS? TAS is treatment in a similar manner as the state. And many of you, if you have the 106, and 319 program, you already went through this. It's very similar for regulatory programs. We have a little bit more in-depth sort of review process for regulatory programs. But tribes can apply to EPA to implement most programs directly similar to a state. They generally submit one TAS application per program, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. So here is a snapshot of nationally how many tribes have these TAS or these regulatory programs. And in the parentheses, it lists the number in Region 9 of how many have that. And I could see from the chat, Rob Roy La Jolla just got it for air and is in the process of getting it for water. So Roberto?
Yeah. I think one of the things we wanted to highlight here is in terms of the region and in the programs, there are fewer regulatory Clean Air Act approvals compared to Clean Water Act. And so we'll talk a little bit about the differences and kind of why that is, or, why a regulatory Clean Air Act program may make sense for some tribes, but not for others. And the Water Division we'll discuss, what comes along with having a water regulatory program. So on the next slide, please. So here we have a list of some of the available regulatory Clean Water Acts. So you see on the left-hand side, we have the Clean Water Act standards, Clean Water certification, treated waters. There's items under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Included in there is the Toxic Substance Control Act, TSCA ones, and then for Clean Air Act, there are different portions of the Clean Air Act that may or may not be appropriate for the tribes to apply for. And for the Clean Air Act, that is outlined under Section 301D, it's outlined under the Tribal Authority Rule or the TAR. A lot of you may be more familiar with or associate, more of the financial assistance portions of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act for funding. So we have the Clean Water Act 106, 319, the non-point source management, and the Clean Air Act 105. We've highlighted here that for the financial assistance portions of the TAS, there is a matching required. But as we talked about in some of the sessions this week and a few others, there's talks about now if you combine them into a PPG, they are waiving the match. So that may be, in the past, I've talked to tribes that have mentioned that the Clean Air Act 105 matching was kind of a barrier or maybe less appealing for a tribe to apply for. And so with this new PPG getting rid of the matching, that may be something that becomes more appealing or attractive. Next slide. So we're going to go into the requirements for applying for TAS, but here's a brief little roadmap that's outlined in the TAR and under the Clean Water Act. So number one, you must be a federally recognized.
We lost him.
Did you lose me?
Danielle, why don't you go ahead and try this slide while we're waiting for him to reconnect?
Oh, okay. 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 So for EPA to approve TAS, there's 4 components: be federally recognized, have a governing body, have authority to regulate the resources on the reservation, and also be capable of carrying out an effective program. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about more about the EPA review process. And if you were at Tomas's session, the Water Division Director session yesterday, we do try
Danielle, Danielle, hold on just a second. We seem to have a confusion here because the chat is saying they can still hear Roberto. We are not seeing him or hearing him here at Mission Control. I'm not quite sure how we resolve that.
That's okay. Let's keep moving forward.
So you don't want to both be talking at the same time, that's for sure.
Okay, I could hear him, and so we're good. We're good.
Okay.
Perfect. So looking at the review process, if you were at Tomas's session yesterday, we do try and review this to do the whole review process of TAS applications within 9 months, a little bit under 9 months, hopefully. We have in the region tried to get better. So if you were at one of my sessions, probably about 5 years ago, I may have said it takes 2 years or longer, and it might, but we have tried to get better and fix some of the delays on EPA's end for reviewing it. So it's really important, and I think Roberto would agree with me in saying that if you are interested, if your tribe is interested in applying for TAS for one of the regulatory programs or even in the grant funding programs, have a conversation with your project officer or someone in that program. We can give a little bit more in-depth discussion on if it makes sense. We could talk a little bit more about the review process. So look at some of the draft documents prior. And go from there. So once we have looked at the draft the draft application and saw that it looks pretty good, we'll go ahead and have you formally submit it. Formally submitted to EPA, it would be a letter to the regional administrator and asking for us to look at it or to formally review it. At this time, we would then start the official administrative index. And one thing to note here is even if we do say it looks pretty good, we may come back to ask for supplemental information if necessary. Next slide, please. So once we receive that application, we then have a clock to go out for public notice and send out AGE letters, which is appropriate governmental entity letters, to the state, other federal agencies, and other tribes that are contiguous to the reservation. We then go out for public notice requesting comment on only jurisdiction. Those are the only comments we consider. We may do some local government outreach if it is appropriate at the with the last administration, that was one of the sort of requirements or changes to the review process, but that since has been rescinded. And so we may still, in order to have a smoother review process with headquarters, but not necessarily a requirement now. And then one other thing is we do offer tribal consultation for tribes with adjacent lands to the applicant. So we do offer tribal consultation, and the tribe may respond to any comments that we receive from that process. Next slide. After that, considering that we hopefully will not receive any comments, if we do, we address those comments. We then write a decision document, and that goes through a pretty lengthy review. So we internally review it in Region 9, and then we also have a headquarters review process, 2-step. So they go back for 14-day quick review. Once the region sort of addresses all the concerns and comments that the headquarters may have, it then goes back for another 30-day review process. And so this takes up a good amount of time. But we have streamlined this process a lot within the past year. And then hopefully once we get approval from the different offices, which is the Office of International Tribal Affairs, I think I said it correctly, Office of Water, and OGC, Office of the General Counsel, then we could go ahead and finalize the document here at Region 9, and then the RA will sign off. And as we saw yesterday, the RA will then present at an RTAC meeting. Next slide. I think this is Ivan.
Yes. Next slide, please. Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here with everyone and provide some input from the Office of Regional Counsel on the legal side. Tom and I are going to take on some of these interesting issues and a little bit of background. I just want to sort of, first of all, reaffirm what Danielle has been saying. ORC works very closely with the program group on the development of TAS reviews and approvals. And we really have been able to expedite and improve the processing of TASs in the past few years. So once a TAS application gets in process, it now moves fairly quickly and smoothly through the process, which really I think is in everyone's best interest once a tribe is ready to take on the obligations. I just want to start out with a little bit of sort of just some of the relevant framework, call it an impressionistic history here, just for folks' background. Obviously, a lot of our tribal programs and Indian law programs go back to the 1984 EPA Indian policy, which has just been reaffirmed by the administrator, as every administrator since '84 has affirmed it. In particular, I think it's item 3 in the EPA Indian policy, which states really that EPA will work with tribes to develop regulatory programs and take those over as appropriate. And I think that really has spurred a lot of the TAS work that we do. There are specific authorities under the programs for treatment in a similar manner as a state. I put some of the sites in here. For USEPA 131.8 for clean water, for USEPA Part 49 for clean air, and then a number for Safe Drinking Water Act. These are the main TASs that we work on, and there are the statutory sections too that embody that. So, you know, it's always good to remind yourself and look at both these regulatory and statutory sites as you consider taking on one of these programs. There is a strategy out there. It's a publicly available strategy. If you Google it, EPA treatment in a similar manner as a state strategy, 2008. It's worth looking at because it sort of spells out the process that Roberto and Danielle were talking about. The one thing to note is it is I don't want to say dated, but some of the components have been updated. For instance, and we'll talk about this in a moment. For Clean Water Act TASs, we no longer do inherent sovereignty analysis and the fact findings that go with that, because it's been interpreted to be a congressional delegation. So it's a lot more straightforward now. There is also the tribal consultation policy in situations for coordination and consultation, and we will often engage as appropriate in consultation with tribes, all tribes that maybe have an interest in the TAS approval, such as adjacent tribes and so forth. And then the Reinterpretation Act for Clean Water Act 2016, that's where we sort of affirmed our interpretation of the Clean Water Act Section 518 as a congressional delegation, and we'll talk a bit about that more as well. Next slide. These are just some general principles looking back at who's been approved and who hasn't under TAS, or at least the numbers. It's clear that some tribes step forward and take on these programs. Some decide they don't, and it's really an individualized decision. EPA is here to work with tribes on these, especially the regulatory ones. But each tribe, I think the factors that are considered are myriad. For instance, if you're looking at water quality standards, it probably depends on what water bodies you have within your reservation. Do you have rivers that flow, from areas under state jurisdiction to tribal areas? In those situations, it may make more sense to have a water quality standard program versus if there's, say, less water resources. Same with the air program. Different tribes also are in different, places in terms of their environmental program development, and certainly the idea is to get every tribe to the point where they're able and willing to take these on, or at least they can if that's in their benefit. And so, part of that is issuing the grant agreements and other things where we can get resources to tribes. So bottom line is really do what makes the most sense for your tribe, but we are here on both the program and legal side to talk through the issues and help you all make that decision. Next slide. This one's to you, Tom.
Okay, thank you. Again, I'm Tom Hagler in the Regional Counsel's Office, and I'm going to focus on the Clean Water Act 303 TASs, and then a little bit later, Roberto is going to talk about the Clean Air Act TAS process. So why should a tribe want to set water quality standards at all? Why should they want to get in the middle of that? And this chart is designed basically to show you the central role that the water quality standards play in the federal Clean Water Act. They basically describe the desired condition of the water body. They set the goal. What are we aiming for as to each water body in your jurisdiction? And then there's a whole set of programs. These are three of the big ones that under the federal scheme address each part of that. So you've got your point source program, which is NPDES permits, 402 permits, the same thing. You've got the non-point source program, which is, admittedly a little more weak in the federal scheme because we can set things through the TMDL, the total maximum daily load program. We can set allocations, but we really can't enforce it directly. That goes to the state or the tribe. And then there's 401 certification, which is a process whereby the state or the tribe has to certify the discharges that have a federal permit or license are not going to adversely affect your compliance, the project's compliance with with water quality standards. So in all of these other regulatory things that do have hammers associated with them, water quality standards basically they drive those. So it's important to get them right, and they may vary depending on the conditions on your tribe or in different states. It's so water quality standards are kind of the linchpin. Next slide, please, Loretta. So when I was looking at this earlier, this is a little bit redundant, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. So TAS is it's the formal recognition that a tribe has the legal jurisdiction and the institutional capability to set water quality standards. That's what it is. And it allows the tribe to develop those standards and request federal approval for them. It doesn't do the federal approval at the same time, but it allows the tribe to apply for that. This slide has two kind of caveats that I wanted to flag, and I didn't know where else to put them. One of them is to realize that when the tribe adopts water quality standards, those standards might conflict with a neighboring jurisdiction. standards for the same water body. And in that case, there's a provision in the regulations where EPA's regional administrator is basically asked to mediate it. There's some additional provisions in the regulations asking for the upstream state to consider the downstream state standards or tribe standards when they're writing their permits and doing any action, including setting water quality standards. But if you really get into a conflict, then it's the regional administrator for EPA that's supposed to come in and try to mediate that. The second point on this slide, and it's kind of getting to be an important one, is that there is a workload issue associated with having your own water quality standards program. Not only do you have to adopt the first set, but you also have a triennial review requirement where you're supposed to make changes depending on changes in conditions or desired outcomes. There is a lot of help in creating these standards and in reviewing these standards, in particular for priority pollutants. Section 304A has asked EPA to set up basically a whole list of kind of default standards that we think should be considered by all jurisdictions in adopting them, and that allows you to avoid having to do all the work on setting standards from scratch. But if you have something that is site specific that you want to put on your in your jurisdiction, you're going to have to come up with the scientific justification for that. So that's a resource issue. Next slide. So I thought I'd get into some of the negatives, and I noticed I'm already running into one of these in the chat box questions. So what does the TAS for 303 for Clean Water Act standards, what does it not do for you? Because this is a little confusing as people dive into this. Is like, well, does this help me with that, or does this help me with something else? So here's what it does not do for you. It does not expand your jurisdiction. It just recognizes for TAS purposes your existing jurisdiction. And in particular, it doesn't give you any enforcement authority. So our approval of the TAS and our approval of the water quality standards doesn't enhance your enforcement capabilities as a tribe. Those same enforcement mechanisms that were in place are still the ones that we would have to use. TAS, the Clean Water Act, does not deal with groundwater at all. And it doesn't deal with water rights, and it doesn't deal with fishing rights. So those are not things that the TAS process is going to help you with or hurt you by. So just be aware of that. And then the last one is a little bit esoteric, but if you know what the waters of the United States issue is all about, the TAS process is not an actual determination that any particular water body constitutes a water of the United States. And that has a lot of regulatory ramifications if you are determined as being such, but that doesn't happen in the regulatory TAS approval program. Okay, next page, next slide, Loretta. And then what we normally do, and this is also kind of being reviewed, is when we grant 303 TAS, we also grant it for Clean Water Act Section 401. And what is 401? Well, it gives the tribe power to issue water quality certifications for activities that need a federal permit or a license if those activities discharge into the reservation's water. And the certification is supposed to evaluate and decide whether that activity is adversely affecting water quality on the reservation. So when does that apply? Well, federal permits and licenses. The big ones are MPDS discharge permits. The second biggest is probably Section 404 dredge and fill permits that the Corps issues. But also there's some big ones, and those have been controversial lately. So pipelines, they usually need to get a 404 permit. So if someone's going to run a pipeline through your reservation, they're going to need a 404 permit most likely. And they are going to need a tribal certification if you've got the 401 certification. FERC dam licenses, same thing. Those sometimes get controversial because of what they do to the hydrological regime on the river. So if you have the 401 cert and you issue a certification that has conditions, those conditions must be added to the federal permit or license. There's no way around that. So this can be a powerful tool for protecting water quality, But as you may have heard previous sessions, and I'll talk about a little bit later, there's a lot of controversy about 401 right now, primarily caused by both a couple of cases and by some regulatory actions that happened under the last administration. So we'll get into that later. So this has been all about Clean Water Act, TAS. Kind of sped through that because we're trying to leave room for questions at the end. But now I'd like to have Roberto discuss the TAS for the Clean Air Act. And I still can't hear him, so I'm assuming it's all going to be fine.
I hadn't been talking, but hopefully you can hear me now. I see Ivan looked up, so that's a good sign, right? All right, thank you. So yes, we going to go over the Clean Air Act TAS overview. And so the Clean Air Act authorizes EPA to treat eligible Indian tribes as states for certain purposes and sets out the general criteria for the eligibility. In 1998, the EPA promulgated the Tribal Authority Rule, or the TAR, which specifies those provisions of the Clean Air Act that are not appropriate for TAS for tribes, and therefore we can talk about the ones that are appropriate. The TAR also set forth the procedures for EPA's review of requests for eligibility determinations, and we've kind of covered those already in the beginning, but I'll reiterate that the eligibility requirements are: 1, you must be a federally recognized tribe; 2, you must demonstrate a governing body is carrying out substantial governmental duties and powers; 3, ability to implement programs consistent with the Clean Air Act; and 4, ability to identify the exterior boundaries of the reservation. And I see there's a few questions about the boundaries that I think will be covered by Ivan later, and we can discuss those towards the end of the presentation as well. So the TAR also includes flexibilities, which allows tribes to apply for regulatory Clean Air Act provisions, but does not require tribes to submit a tribal implementation plan or a TIP. For example, a tribe can request TAS for regulatory Clean Air Act provisions, but only submit a TIP for a subsection of the provision. So you might be interested in a certain portion of the Clean Air Act and apply for a regulatory TAS, but only actually implement a small portion of it. During the next designations process under Clean Air Act Section 107, we encourage and have tribes are allowed to submit recommendations to the EPA without necessarily having TAS. For us, for Clean Air Act under permitting, if a tribe has 1 or 2 stationary sources but does not have an EPA-approved permitting program, EPA still remains the permitting authority on tribal lands and would issue the permits to new or modified major and minor sources of tribal lands. So, depending on the tribe's capacity, the environmental program, and their goals, applying for a regulatory permitting program for Clean Air Act may not make sense because of all the resources involved. Other Clean Air Act sections that are eligible for TAS that are not regulatory, but are tied to the permitting process that you might want to consider, they include Clean Air Act Section 126, which requires state and local districts to provide notification for any new or modified PSD sources to any downwind states prior to construction or modification. So that notifies the tribes. And then additionally, Clean Air Act Section 505A2, again, that one portion, that establishes notification procedures for Title V permitting programs to notify contiguous affected states whose air quality may be impacted by the state in which the emissions originate. So those are a way of those are sections that you might want to consider that aren't regulatory, but are kind of tied to a regulatory program. And again, like Danielle mentioned, if you are interested in Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act, please come talk to any one of your POs, and we can provide you with more information and connect you with one of our attorneys. Next slide.
Okay, so I'm going to follow up that now that we've sort of talked a little bit about Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act TASs and what the options there and some of the issues. I just want to address a couple generalized topics of interest that apply to all of these regulatory TASs and provide some context. I think some folks have had some questions about these, and we've often gotten them in the past. The first is just a clarification that the TAS is, at least for Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, generally apply to reservation areas only. It's statutory in the case of the Clean Water Act, and there's some complex case law on the Clean Air Act side, but that's for practical purposes. The easiest and the most straightforward and the typical way is that it's for reservation areas. But it does raise the question about what exactly comprises a reservation. And it's important to keep in mind that obviously there's the formal reservations that are formally recognized under an executive order or even a treaty. But the courts have also established that tribal trust lands, even though they're outside the formal reservation, are considered informal reservation and are equally included within that scope in that TAS application as if it were within the exterior boundaries of the defined reservation. So that's basically the scope of the areas that are most straightforward and that we typically look at for these applications. Next slide, please. The one other thing to keep in mind is the jurisdictional authority or the assertion of jurisdiction that's necessary for TAS. Historically, it relies on, TAS typically relies, if in absence of other direction, on the concept that most folks should be very well aware of, inherent sovereignty, going back to the Marshall Trilogy court cases, that really the tribe is the one that has primary authority to oversee matters within the reservation, and that's obviously a strong basis. The difficulty with that, and this is where the rub is that there is case law though demonstrating the difficulty of actually a tribe regulating non-members, and particularly non-members on fee land, even within the reservation. And that goes back to the Montana v. US. Tribes can still come in and regulate those non-members, but there's that test that most folks know, that there has to be a showing that it somehow threatens or has an effect on things like the political integrity and the health or welfare of the tribe. We were, before some of these congressional delegations came along, we were using these and relying on the inherent sovereignty and even getting past the Montana test. But it does take more time and effort, both on the sides, on the side of the tribe as well as EPA when we do the approvals. Next slide. The development here, and I think it's it makes a lot of sense in terms of where Congress was going with this, is that there's the legal argument or interpretation that at least the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act really are direct congressional delegations of authority to tribes to administer their programs within the exterior boundaries of the reservation. And it makes sense because water flows from parcel to parcel, and so does air. It makes sense having a holistic regulatory approach. And the good thing about this is it gets us away from the inherent sovereignty analysis and the Montana test. So really what it comes down to for Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act purposes is you simply have to identify the geographic boundaries of the reservation. No more test in regard to member, non-member activities and so forth. And so it really has streamlined. And again, this got clarified in the Clean Water Act context in that 2016 Federal Register notice cited there. And that's actually worth reading as well. Next slide.
I think we're back to me. So this slide is highlighting something that I believe you had the session on yesterday. And if you did not attend that session, it is recorded and it is worth looking at. I'm not going to get into this in detail for a couple of reasons. One is that we don't have time, and the other is that I'm on a work group and I'm not allowed to say anything about them, but because they're active rulemaking processes. But these four that I've highlighted are regulatory actions that we are undertaking and they may have a direct impact on tribal authority or on the water quality standards program. And I want you to be aware of them. And I recommend especially that you follow them so that you can see where they end up over the next couple of years. What are they? Well, again, the first two are a result of President Biden came in on day number one and issued an edict that said we're supposed to, not an edict, an executive order, saying that we're supposed to review for EPA 48 different actions that were taken by the previous administration. We are reviewing them and then rewriting regulations for a lot of those, but the two top ones there are the waters of the U.S. definition and the whole 401 certification regulations are at the top of our list and of our workload as well. Without going into a lot of detail, I think the sense was that the previous administration had swung too far in a direction that did not respect state and tribal prerogatives, and that complicated both the scope analysis for the reach of these provisions and the process for dealing with them. And that's all I'm going to say, period. There are also two other regulations that we're working on. One is, I think, the baseline water quality standards for tribes that do not have federally approved water quality standards. And I believe that was in a session yesterday. And then there's this whole effort to look at whether there is a mechanism in the water quality standards regulations to have states evaluate, recognize, and respect through water quality standards provisions any reserved rights that tribes may have either by treaty, by statute, or by some other formalized mechanism. All four of those are, I think they could be really important in a tribe's decision as to whether to pursue TAS, and also if you already have TAS, it will affect how you carry that out. Next slide, please. Couple real short ones here, and then I know we all want to get into some questions. So can you do a TAS for just a segment of the reservation? The answer is yes, but on balance, I think that EPA, especially after the reinterpretive rule, is really trying to encourage tribes to take control of their regulatory programs within their reservation. It's a sovereignty thing. That said, I think that very clearly there are circumstances where a tribe may not want to exercise jurisdiction over particular segments. There may be pre-existing laws or regulations that limit your ability to regulate something. I'm thinking right now of, for example, Central Arizona project in the Bureau of Reclamation. They managed to get a lot of federal legislation that limits the tribe's abilities to regulate them. So that's fine. We will recognize it to a well-defined segment of the reservation, and it's not permanent either. If you come in and you say we only want it as to these 5 parcels, we'll work through that with you. And then if you say, no, wait, I think we're now at a point where we can exercise jurisdiction over the entire reservation, we'll work through that with you. So the main thing is we need to be able to tell the public and the regulated community what's in and what's out and who's the boss for that parcel. Next slide, please. Boundaries. Sometimes it's a horrible mess and sometimes it's really easy. I think usually I think by now we're fairly far down the road of having well-defined boundaries, but we do have situations where, and a couple come to mind. One is if you've got natural features that are the boundaries. So if you've got a meandering river and it meanders, then we got to figure out where is the actual boundary of the reservation. Similarly, there are sometimes ongoing boundary disputes, and some of these have been going on for decades. How do we resolve them in the TAS process? I've actually had tribes who have agreed to go ahead and get a formal survey so we can, definitively say this is what's in and this is what's out. If you have a long-going dispute, I've also seen us do carve-outs where we just say, okay, this area here, we're not going to deal with it. We're just going to keep EPA as the as the authority in that segment, and we will grant TAS as to the rest of the reservation. So that's every one of them is different. It's an ongoing problem, but it's not as big of a problem as it was maybe 25 years ago. I mean, that's my impression. Next slide, please. And then finally, I've had this question come in a bunch. What happens? A lot of tribes are going through the process of reacquiring their homelands, and that's great. And there's a whole formalized process for doing that. And if you do that, you can then expand your TAS as well. As Ivan said earlier, we will treat additional parcels that are outside of the formal reservation, but that have been taken into trust by BIA on behalf of the tribe. We will treat that as your reservation for purposes of TAS. And if you have a TAS already and you want to expand it with these additional parcels, once it's brought into trust with BIA, we would do it in a fairly expedited way. I do realize, and it's still depressing, that it takes a long time to get new parcels taken into trust by BIA. I don't have a good answer to that, but that's kind of the trigger for our reinterpretive rule, is that it would have to be taken into trust by BIA on behalf of that named tribe for it to be brought in easily. So, and that, I think, is all I had. Who does it go to now, Danielle?
So here is just some useful resources that you can look at a little bit later on that Tom and Ivan and Roberto have gone over in this presentation. Next slide. Is there another slide? Okay. I think that's it for the presentation. I really do want to get to the questions. Thank you, Jason, for trying to answer some of the questions in the chat. We have about 7 minutes. So the first question that has not been answered, I believe, is from Mervyn. And the question is the congressional delegation of authority for tribal TAS truly equal to that of state TAS?
And I can jump in and answer that. Yeah, unfortunately, it's not. Each statute lays out the authority for TAS. So, for instance, it's Section 518 of the Clean Water Act, and that's where those elements that are required for tribes to be treated in a similar manner as a state are laid out. The substantial government functions, the capabilities, the jurisdictional assertions. So that's for better or for worse, is part of the actual congressional and statutory language. And again, we're working as hard as we can to streamline those and make it as seamless as possible. But those are still the mandates that we have under statute.
Great.
And anything to add to that, Tom?
No, I think that's correct and true.
The next question from James is, how do we define boundaries when a tribe only has scattered fee, trust, and BIA allotments?
It goes back to that distinction between formal and informal. Informal would be if you have a formal reservation, it's defined. It's usually in a contiguous area, but there may be parcels that are spread out. I've actually just went through this with one of the tribes that they had parcels spread up and down a valley of about 40 miles long, and we just did it based on a parcel by parcel basis. If they could show, and we used the BIA parcel system, where they keep track of this. We pulled out the with the help of BIA local office, we pulled out the parcel maps and ownership, and we got a list of the ones that had been brought into trust by BIA on behalf of that tribe, and we granted it for a designated list, so that at least for the Clean Water Act, that was a fairly straightforward process. It was tedious, but it was straightforward, and I think it was a good resolution for the tribe. Clean Air Act, I don't know how you do it because I don't do Clean Air Act.
I think it would be the same. You
Okay.
look at the informal reservation, which would be the trust land that it held on behalf of the tribe, even if that was allotments.
Great, thank you. Mervin has another question. Are there current EPA Clean Water Act actions aiming to restrict TAS applications?
That's a loaded question, isn't it? That is not the intent, either stated or otherwise. There may be an effect, and I guess I don't. I guess what you're referring to by the current EPA actions, are we talking about the 2020 regulations? Which, and I think the answer would be yes. As to the new regulation efforts, the only, would they have an effect of reducing TAS applications? I don't know. If I think we're going to have to see how that plays out with especially things like baseline standards, because if you have baseline standards, a tribe may not feel a need to go ahead and set up their own standards. But that's a guess, and I think that's an empirical thing we'll have to see if we ever get that out the door. Okay, I'm sorry. I wasn't implying it was really loaded. It's a tricky question, and I think we all need to kind of look at it again. I think in my whole career here, with maybe one exception, the EPA administrations have usually been supportive of expanding TAS by tribes, and it's been kind of hit or miss as to how well we have done that. But this raft of massive regulations that came out last year, and then a lot of it's going to be changed in some way, next year or this year, is going to affect the calculus that tribes have as to whether they want to do it or not. And I just think we're going to have to see how that plays out, and maybe make adjustments if we blow it, because I think there is, at least in the staff level, professional staff level, up pretty high, there's a commitment to getting TASs done for whatever tribes want it. Anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just say, I mean, from what I understand, there's nothing in it that is really in any way meant to inhibit or limit TAS applications. And I think if I've seen any direction, it's really being more protective in Indian country and providing more opportunities. So I too would hope that it actually doesn't limit, and if anything, it helps continue to expand TASs and provide those opportunities.
And just a quick sort of plug, Tina Yen, the manager of the Water Quality Standards section, is having a session at 11 o'clock today. So please join that if you're if you want to learn more. One last question, because I know we have less than 2 minutes, is how does a regional administrator evaluate discrepancies between tribal TAS and adjacent regulatory agencies?
We basically mediate it, and it usually comes up in the context of a particular permit or a particular regulatory action. What we've done in Region 9 on the ones I worked on is we've tried to identify those potential discrepancies early on in the process. And for example, on Klamath, where we've got a bundle of both tribal and two states involved, we set up a whole work group to make sure that there was some consistency in the water quality standards and in the TMDLs that were based on those standards. And we did a pretty good job, even though we got sued on it. But it's really tricky. And I think it's trickier when you have adversarial jurisdictions. And I know that happened up in the Washington State, Idaho area, where there's several tribes involved, and it took them a while to work it out. But it's a mediation process, and it's just what it is.
Great. Well, we have 26 seconds left, and so I wanted to take that time to thank you all for joining this session. Thank Ivan, Roberto, Tom, Loretta, Kate, Jason, for that sounded like an acceptance speech, for being here. I believe our contact information is under the speaker notes, so please let us know if you have any other questions. We are here, and thank you. Have a good day.
Everyone.
Thank you.